Welcome to the Journey Home. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this program, and we're here in England again, EWTN's second trip to England, filming converts who are sharing their journeys to the Catholic faith. And we're here in Brompton Oratory, actually a library called the Little Oratory, as a part of this very famous place that traces its history back to a number of very famous English converts, John Henry Cardinal Newman and Father Faber, who was the author of a hymn that almost every one of you has sung, Faith of the Fathers. Our guest for this episode is Ruth REES. Ruth, welcome to the Journey Home.
Thank you.
It's great to meet you and also to be here with you. This is the 10th year of the Journey Home program. For 10 years we've been interviewing many men and women who, because of their love for Christ, were brought home to the Catholic Church. All the converts have a little bit different journey, and I know yours is a little bit different because it wasn't just your love for Christ, but you came from a very anti-Christian perspective in your journey.
Yes,
so
yes.
let me get out of the way and ask if you would begin early and let us know a little bit of your background.
Well, I came from a nominally very Jewish family. When I say nominally, because English Jews can be split up, as most other Jewish communities can, between the ones who practice the high days and holidays and the ones who are extremely orthodox, the little, sort of ringlets and whatnot.
Yes.
My family weren't like that. They used to have their Pesach nights, the Passover. They went to the synagogue on high days and holidays. I used to go with them. And as you know, the women are always separated from the men in synagogues. And we used to sit upstairs in the gallery, and I was aware of everybody looking at a prayer book, but there's a lot of talking in between. And the men were down below. Everybody was very well dressed. And I started reading the prayer books, and I read all about what had happened to the Jews in the past and the terrible things that had been done to them. So I grew up, knowing all this and becoming fiercely pro-Jewish. I went to Hebrew school. I even won a prize for my Hebrew. And that's what I can say about my Jewish background. Now,
Let me ask you, what amazes me is that I've known Jews in my life who do the Jewish things, live the Jewish life, but are not believers. In other words, they call themselves Jews, but yet they don't quite believe it. I've met some. And I want to is that what your background was?
No.
You were believers in God.
What don't they believe?
They almost don't believe in the reality of God. They almost believe more in their Jewish background, their Jewish heritage, their Jewish practice, but not in the reality of God. What I'm wondering is I want to make sure to my audience that was not of which you come from.
Well, it's meaningless, isn't it?
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. That's a sort of, it's ridiculous. Now, of
Well,
course,
it's a bit like Catholics that are brought up doing Catholic things but don't believe. It's a bit like
they
the same.
believed. And I certainly believed. And I used to pray at quite an early age, too.
Okay.
And then during the war, when I was quite young, the Blitz was very unpleasant in London, and my father, who'd fought in the First World War, was too old to fight in that last war. So we went to live in a little village in Oxfordshire, in the most enchanting little village called Watlington, which was named after Watling Street, which was part of the path made by the Romans across England, and it's amongst the Chiltern Hills, beautiful. And I loved living in the country, but of course there were no synagogues. So, the longer I lived there in the country, the deeper I believed in God, because my great passion, amongst other great passions, are stars. And I used to go up the Chiltern Hills and look at the sky. I just loved the stars. And this brought me to an interest in and a fear of eternity and infinity, even as a youngster. I thought, how can the world just go on and on and on and no end? What does it all mean? So I began asking my parents these questions. They said, don't be so morbid. No, go out and play with your friends or something.
As Jews, did you believe in any kind of resurrection, afterlife? I know it's different. Jews have different perspectives on that.
I don't think my thinking got that far at that early age.
Right. So when you looked at eternity, you didn't...
Eternity. That's one of the reasons I was afraid of eternity, perhaps, because I didn't know.
Didn't have a concept, all right.
And I remember something very strange, and I think in retrospect, I was really in my early teens, and something had upset me deeply, deeply. I can't remember what it was. And I was really tearful. And I remember out of the blue, I thought, I'm going to offer it up to God. It's an extraordinary thing for a Jewish youngster to do. Don't know where it came from. Must have come from my future, you know.
But the idea of sacrifice, I mean,
it's not part of the Jewish sort of theology, you know, sort of ordinary people. So there we are. And then after the war, my father's sort of working life and our home in London had been sort of completely destroyed. And a friend of his from the First World War, who was South African, said he should come over to South Africa and start up again there. And it so happened that there is a large section of my family who are South Africans. And we went over to South Africa. And already, I should just backtrack slightly, even while I was in England, I was trained in theatre, because where I was living, there was a former actress from the old Vic who turned into becoming a teacher of drama, and she taught me, and she pushed me, and she used to take me up to London, even during the Blitz, to meet, you know, various people who of influence, and they all said, yes, I should continue with this. And so when I went to South Africa, I had an interview with a very famous here, Shakespearean actress. Her name was Gwen Franken Davis. And she saw a little bit of my work, and she said, well, when you go to South Africa, I'm going to give you a letter of introduction to the principal of the drama department of the University of Cape Town. She's a friend, and the course they do there is both a drama course but also teaching, and there's no point in you doing teaching. So I'm going to write this letter to say she must make an exception and just let you do the drama side. That's exactly what happened, and I absolutely loved it because I was mad then, as I am now, about Shakespeare. And it was a very happy time. And then I started doing, when I left the Little Theatre, it was called Little Theatre, the University of Theatre, I started doing bits and pieces of drama. And then, trying to get it all in its sequence, then a famous theatrical personality came out. I'm sure you've heard him, Ivor Novello. Heard of Ivor Novello?
I don't know much about him, but I've heard the name.
Yes, but he brought out one of his musicals. It was called, I can't remember, anyway. And I met him socially, and I said, look, I've reached as far as I can go over here, and I'm thinking of going back to England. But I won't go if I'm just another wannabe. So if I do will you let me do an audition for you, and will you be brutally frank with me? And if you think that it's best if I look elsewhere, tell me, because I don't want to waste my time. He said, well, I'll take you at your word. And I did an audition for him in between the sort of the intervals in his performance. And he said, yes, you must come back, and I'll do what I can for you. And he was very good. He went on stage afterwards, and he said, you have a lot of theatrical talent here in this country, but you don't have the professional theatres, and I do ask you to try and do something about this. And he came off and he said, okay? And I said, okay. I came back to England, and I stayed with my mother's sister, and I was in touch with Ivor Novello. Unfortunately, he died soon afterwards. And then I was taken up by various theatrical people. I found myself one Christmas, through unforeseen circumstances, with nowhere to live. It was one of the coldest Christmases that England's ever had. The ice was thick on the ground, and I found myself walking around the streets of London in this freezing cold, not knowing where I was going to sleep at the end of the week. I eventually found a horrible little bedsit somewhere in the north of London, and even the window wouldn't shut. It was half open because it was stuck, and I was terrified of what was going to happen. Meanwhile, a friend of mine who was an actress, and she was a Catholic actress, nothing to me at the time, she discovered my plight and she said, hang on, I'm going to see if I can help you. And she rang up the Interval Club. Now, the Interval Club then was a was a club for Catholic actresses.
Specifically for
Catholic actresses, only women. And it was in the heart of Soho. And they were the most wonderful bunch of people. And she did something marvelous. She asked two of the girls to move in together, and she gave me the room. They took me in over this terrible Christmas. It's very symbolic.
Yes.
And I stayed there for 3 or 4 months. And afterwards, I did some work, just temp work, sort of typing or something. And I found myself a bedsit in South Ken, here. And then one day, a friend of mine from South Africa, a Jewish girl, now she came from an Orthodox family, and she rang me up. She said, "Ruth, I know you have a lot of Catholic theatre friends, and can you arrange for me to meet them, because I want to become a Catholic."
Whoa. Now, when you were at that, what was the name of that place you were at?
Interval Club.
Was it a part of their agreement that they talked to you about your...
Then nobody even mentioned religion to me. They all knew I was Jewish. There wasn't the slightest attempt to proselytize, not once. And I remember one...
They just cared for you.
Well, I'll tell you something that did happen one day. We were all together, and there was one of the chaps there, one of the actors, and he was saying something. He was saying, oh, he was just a bloody, blaspheming Jew. And I turned around and I said, well, does that make me a bloody, blaspheming Jewess? And he went scarlet. He said, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. He was in a terrible state. I'm sure he rushed off to confession afterwards, you know. But it just shows, you know, they never discussed religion, ever. They were wonderful. But I had to. I collected a group of them to come round to my little bedsit, asked Hilda around. And one of my friends, Colin, he said, can I bring round my friend who is leaving theatre? He's going to become a priest. He's going to a seminary. I said, oh, God, honestly. I said, well, okay, bring him round and you can both talk to Hilda. And they came round. And so I had all these friends, and I was with one group, and I was watching these 3 people. And eventually I had to go over and listen in, and Hilda's looking up at them, rapt. And this potential priest, John, everything he was saying, I was attacking. I was butting in all the time, questioning, being very aggressive. And eventually he turned to me and he said, look, have you ever read the New Testament? And I said, certainly not. He said, well, at least have the courtesy to go and read it and find out what you're talking about. Then you can come back and attack me. And I thought, well, okay, fair enough. I need facts. So I went out. I actually bought myself a New Testament, and I sat in my little bed sit, and I read it from beginning to end without a break. And all I can tell you, Marcus, is that I came out of it a different person than the person who went into it. In retrospect, I see that very clearly. It shattered me, because everything I read there about Christ had nothing to do with the Christ I'd been told about. This awful man who did such harm to the Jews, because I was very, very anti-Christian. And so I went back and I did ask John these questions, and he got to the stage where he said, look, you're asking theological questions, and I can't help you at this stage. I think you must go and, he said, I have a friend who is a Dominican, and they're theologians. He said, he's in Hampstead, in Belsize Park. Would you like to speak to him? And I said, well, yes, if you can answer my questions. So an appointment was made, and I went along, and this wonderful priest, he's no longer with us, alas. He was a Belgian priest originally. His name was Father Simon Blake, and he was very pro-theatre, and he had a lot of actor friends. And he didn't try and convert me. He said, you ask the questions, I will answer them to the best of my ability. So I did. I simply asked questions, and he answered them, that's all. He said, now you go away, and I'm here if you want me. And of course I thought, and I started praying, because I must tell you something I've left out. All those years I told you I was praying, you know, I did pray long before I was a Catholic, and I went through all the different isms and osophies, Buddhism.
You were exploring philosophies and other
except the enemy, Christianity. Never that. And eventually I said a prayer into the unknown, and I prayed, if there is such a thing as God, please let me know. If not, I'll have to accept that. Simple. Anyway, so then I started that was about a few years before. In retrospect, I can see the pattern of all this, how God worked through this. So then, speaking to Father Simon, many questions arose, and then I started praying in churches. And what was the first church? Oh, the very first church I went to was before this happened. Can I bring it in? Mm-hmm. A famous ballet dancer called Nijinsky. He was the world's greatest ballet dancer at the time. He had recently died, and he was a Catholic, unlike all his family and friends who were Russian Orthodox. And he had his Requiem Mass at St. James's Spanish Place. Have you ever been there?
No.
Well, it's near Baker Street. And I went there. I came across London. I went across London. And the church was crowded with some of them very famous faces, ballerinas from all over the world. And I didn't understand why the bells kept ringing and people kept kneeling and standing up and kneeling down again. And that was that. That church is now my parish church, St. James's Spanish Place, and one of the most beautiful churches in London. So again, there was a Spanish contact, the Spanish connection, which has become so important later on.
Okay.
So, having had all these, this instruction from Father Dominic, from Father Simon, I started going to Mass. And I had a great friend, close friend at the time, who was an Italian-Canadian. He was a lecturer at the Architectural Association. And when he heard I was interested in Christianity, he said, I've been praying for your conversion for months. He said, now, he said, I'm going to take you to Mass at my church. I said, what's your church? And it's a church next door. What's the one, is it next door, the oratory, the Anglican church?
Oh, Holy Trinity.
Holy Trinity.
Yes.
And he took me there, and it was beautifully sort of celebrated, and the music was wonderful, and everything else was wonderful, and the sermon, except I didn't believe it for a minute, because there was no real presence. And when I came out, I didn't say anything, but it was soon after this when I told him I was thinking of becoming a Catholic, and he was horrified. He said, but why? What did you think about the service? I said, it was wonderful. It was much better than many masses I've been to. But it wasn't, for me, the truth. There was no real presence. That is the whole heart of our faith. And that's how it went. And I got to the stage where I wanted to be received into the church. Now, I knew I could not possibly do this without my parents knowing. So I wrote this letter to my parents, which is very well ill-advised, because it was, I should not have done that. I don't know what I could have done, but I just said to them, you'll be upset, that's putting it mildly, but this is what I want to do, and I really feel this, etc. And my mother came rushing over from South Africa on the orders of my father.
To save you.
To save me, yes. And she said, your father is in a terrible state. And he said, it's all because of your theatrical friends. If you hadn't been with all your theatrical friends, this wouldn't have happened, and you ought to come back. So I thought, fine. So from Father Simon, he gave me the address of the Dominicans in Cape Town. And I went back, and it took 3 years, because being back, I had to be forced into the domestic situation. I had to find a job, and which I did, not in theatre. And I also found myself in a situation where apparently I was engaged. And I know people can't understand my saying this.
Engaged.
Well, apparently engaged, because it's very easy if you don't want to hurt people and you don't give a straight answer. And this was the Jewish community, remember, and a very eligible young man. My parents loved him, he loved them, and I had a great circle of friends. And eventually I was getting iller and iller, because I wasn't living what I wanted to live. I was getting very upset and depressed. And I was having instruction from a marvelous priest then in Stellenbosch, which is a university city. The Dominicans were there. His name was Father Bonaventure Perquin. He's quite well known in the Catholic literary world. He's no longer here. And I got to the stage well, I couldn't bear it anymore. And I went to my father and my mother. I said, I want to become a Catholic. And he became berserk. I mean, not berserk, but he became deeply upset. And after about a week, he came to me and he said, there's one thing we want you to do before you take this step. We want you to go and see a psychiatrist. I said, a psychiatrist? He says, well, please, we want you to go and see one. And I know why, because this chap who thought I was going to marry him, himself, he had been to a psychiatrist years ago. And I have a feeling that he's the one who sort of said, oh, you know, send you to a psychiatrist. And I went to see a psychiatrist, a Jewish psychiatrist. And he said to me at the end of just chatting to me why I wanted to do this, he said, well, Miss REES, some women in their 20s become nymphomaniacs, some become kleptomaniacs, and some become dipsomaniacs. But I think you are in danger of becoming a religious maniac. So I got up and I said, thank you very much. And I went out and I had a row with my parents. I said, how could you do such a thing to me? How could you? So I was furious. And then about 3 weeks later, they came back with another thing. He said, one last thing we want you to do. We want you to go and speak to the chief rabbi of Cape Town. He was a very famous Jewish theologian and academic. His name was Abrahams, Rabbi Abrahams, held in much awe by the Jewish community. So along I toddled. He sat there and said, tell me, Miss REES, why do you want to become a Christian? He didn't say Catholic Christian. I said, because I believe that Christ was our Jewish Messiah. My dear girl, he said, that's not what the Old Testament means. When we talk about the Messiah, we don't mean a person, we mean a time, an era that will come when there will be no more problems for the Jewish people, when they will have a golden age that will continue forever. And I said, well, Rabbi Abrahams, if you think that, then I'm more orthodox than you are. And that was the end of that. He said, I don't think we have anything more to discuss. So that was that. So when I went back to my parents, I realized I was getting nowhere. Meanwhile, the boyfriend had said he's prepared to get married in a Catholic church. I thought, well, I've got to be truthful at this stage. So I arranged within 2 or 3 days, as a fait accompli, to leave Cape Town and just go off to Johannesburg, which I did. Shock, horror all around. Should I continue with this then?
Why don't we take a break now?
Yeah, because yeah.
Let's take a little break. We'll be back in just a moment, and we'll hear the rest of Ruth REES' story. Welcome back to The Journey Home. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. I'm here in England in the Brompton Oratory with our guest Ruth REES. And I kind of interrupt you there right in the middle, but I want to back up a little bit before you start up again, because you mentioned something that I didn't want us to pass by too quickly. You mentioned that you were feeling ill because essentially you were living a lie. Talk about that, because that I know there are people watching who are on the journey that probably know exactly what you're talking about.
Well, I wasn't feeling ill, I was ill. I was in a state of the deepest depression. I knew I was living a lie, and every day that went by was another day of lies, of lying to myself, of lying to God. I wasn't lying to God, God knows what I felt, but I wasn't taking that final step. I was in a dreadful state. And then after this psychiatry encounter, Father Bonaventure, who I think I mentioned was instructing me, he said, I want to speak to your father, give me his phone number. I said, you can't ring my father. He said, I want to speak to your father. So I gave him the number, and he rang him, and I don't know what he said, but all I do know is, yes, I do know what he said, because when I went back, my father, after they met, my father said to me, well, if that's what you want to do, then go ahead, like that. And when I asked Father Bonaventure what he'd said, he said, I said to him that out of all the people I've instructed over the decades, you are the most balanced I've ever come across. And for him to make you go to see a psychiatrist, that was absolutely appalling. And that's why I had some sort of okay. And then I went up to Johannesburg, and I was instructed by a Dominican up there as well. And on November the 15th, 1954, I was received into the Dominican Catholic Church in a little town called Springs. And then I went to work for the South African Broadcasting Corporation, where I stayed for some years. I was writing programs, presenting them, and because they had three channels, the English channel, the Afrikaans, and the commercial channel, I was working for the commercial channel. I had eventually 5 programs of my own a week, but if they wanted an English person speaking Afrikaans with an English accent, then they would have me on a drama, worked out. And then my mother rang me. I rang her to tell her that I'd become a Catholic. I wrote to them, but she rang me and said, in all the years I've been married to your father, it's the first time in our married life I've seen him cry. Can you imagine what that did to me? And I thought, I've got to get down there. So I asked the regional director of the SABC for a transfer, because they'd opened studios recently in Cape Town. And they advised me against it because they said that the director down there was a member of the Broederbond. You know what that is?
No.
It's the neo-fascist organization they used to have in South Africa. And he hates English people. I said, well, I'll take my chances. And I went down. In fact, I was very, very happy there. And I lived with my parents. I wanted them to see that nothing had changed. I said, nothing's changed. My belief hasn't changed me as your daughter. I still love you. And I went on like that for some time. But after about some more years, I decided, for personal reasons, my own personal life had become complicated. I wanted to go back to England. And I was doing, apart from my radio work, I was doing freelance journalist work, journalism with the Cape Times. And a journalist friend of mine there was going to England. And on the way there, he'd stopped off in Spain. And he wrote to me, he said, if you're coming over, he said, go to Las Palmas and catch another ship over to Malaga, the south of Spain, and come and see this lovely, lovely place. So I thought, why not? And I did just that, and I arrived at Malaga. Have you ever been to Malaga at all?
No.
Well, it's southern Andalusia. It's unbelievably beautiful in the Mediterranean. And the minute the ship docked and I stepped on Spanish ground, I felt I was coming home as I'd felt about the Catholic Church coming home. It was a feeling of complete identification.
Is it because of the Catholicism of Spain?
No, nothing to do with the Catholicism. In fact, one Spanish friend said to me, Ruth, if you come and live in Spain as a Catholic, if after some years you're still a Catholic, then you really are a Catholic, as he said to me. Because a lot of the...
Things are rough.
They can be rough, but a lot of it is mixed up with folklore. But they're a deeply Spanish nation, a deeply Catholic nation.
Yes. Right.
And I stayed there for a couple of months in Malaga and in Madrid. And then I came back to England. And I started doing publicity and public relations over here. And then I wanted to go back to Spain. And I was offered a job with the BBC to start at the bottom as a studio manager, and being arrogant, I said I've had 5 programs a week on radio, I'm not going to start as a... So I thought, no, I want to go to Spain. So I answered an advertisement for a very famous holiday tour company called Swans. They were very upmarket, very good organization, and they wanted a resident representative, not in the south, but on the Costa Brava. And I thought, I must get that job. My friend said, Ruth, you don't speak Spanish. I said, so I learned a couple of phrases, really, and I spoke it, I'm an actress. And I went to this meeting with this man, and he was an ex-cavalry officer. And when he discovered that horse riding was my sport. He was delighted. He said, I'm sure we can find a place for you somewhere in Spain, you see. But there's one thing, he said, you'll have to do a little Spanish test with our Spanish expert. I thought, oh, I was absolutely terrified. Now, in those days, I had very black hair, I was very tanned, I looked Spanish. And this tall, blonde Englishman, this Anglo-Saxon came in. He took one look at me and was terrified because he thought I was Spanish. Or he couldn't understand why I was going to have a test. So he said something in very basic Spanish. And little I knew, I responded in very quick Spanish. And he said to his boss and this man, he said, oh no, it's all right, she obviously knows her way around. I got the job. And I went to Spain and I stayed there the whole season. I stayed after the season. Then I went back to South Africa to visit my parents. And I had said to this man, the boss, I said, if ever you're going to open up the south of Spain to British tourism, please think of me first. And he said, we'll never do that, it's far too hot for the British. It's now #1 on the British list. And he sent me a wire those days, a telegram, and said, we're opening up the south of Spain, you have first refusal. So I went straight back to Spain, this time to the place I wanted to go to. And I stayed there for 6 or 7 years. I was absolutely in my element. And they say in Spanish,
Spain.
in mi salsa, in my sauce, you know. And I also I used to visit Gibraltar there. And then after a time, they offered me the company. It was the largest hotel company in the Spanish-speaking world. And they offered me a position in Madrid to start an international public relations set up for all the hotels. I didn't want to go up to Madrid. I love Madrid to visit, but I didn't want to go up there. So I thought it's time for me to go back to England, otherwise I'll stop being English. It was already too late, Marcus, I can tell you that. And I came back and I went into journalism here and into public relations for a long time. I've had some extraordinary public relations jobs and then ending up in journalism. And writing not just for the Catholic press, but for other media as well. But to me, the extraordinary thing about my journey in the faith is that in retrospect, the longer I live, the more I can see the steps that went towards my coming this far. How God used everything in my life. The most awful things somehow were useful. And even now I'm learning that. And that's another thing I want to say, because a lot of converts, when I read their stories, it sounds as though the minute they become Catholic, somehow they become good and wonderful and everything's all right. Isn't like that, because you have to relearn a whole lot of responses. And the fact of looking into yourself and thinking of the things one has done in the past, one by one they not keep coming up because one confesses them, but it never stops, this personal evaluation. And you find that the person I am today is not quite the same person who was here last year. There's always a slight change and modification. And I think, to me, that's the most important thing, is what happens after you become a Catholic, if you're not a Catholic to start with. And that's why, in a way, I envy born Catholics, because they're brought up with right from the beginning. But the learning process can be very painful in your personal life. But
although I will say that, kind of like your own experience, where there are sometimes lifelong Catholics that are born into the faith, but maybe don't appreciate it the way they ought to. And they need an awakening within their own life to appreciate that. When you and I, as converts, we've learned to appreciate it lately, as St. Augustine mentioned, his late conversion to the faith. And you were talking about those, as you look back, some of the ways that God was touching you early on. I'm going to prime the pump for you, because I know there's some things that I want you to talk about, because your mother's name was what?
Miriam.
I mean, just that alone is an entry into a whole part of your life that wasn't a part of your life before, because your relationship with Mary. Talk about that, because that's different. Most Jewish girls don't have a devotion to Mary.
Really?
The way you've ended up with.
What Jewish Catholic girls?
Oh, no, I don't. I mean, Jewish girls.
Oh, I see, right. No, well, I wanted to start. I see all my friends, Catholic friends, who I admired, were praying the Rosary, but I just couldn't get it. To me, it seemed a sentimental thing. And when I was in churches and they were gabbling the Rosary, particularly not then. I don't know how it started. And then I thought, yes, I know how it started. It started when I was living in Spain, and I was the PR director for this hotel. And one day, a Spanish, and I'm still the correspondent of various publications in England and in Canada. And one day, a Spanish journalist came in, rushing in. I was having lunch at RUTH, you've got to come immediately. There's a hotel, he mentioned the name, down the road, and the roof has collapsed. And there are 3 children, 3 little English children, who are trapped, and their parents are in a state of hysteria, and none of us speak English. Can you come and help? The roof had collapsed, but it had affected the entire building. So I raced over there, and there were the mother and father. The father was struck dumb, he couldn't speak. And the wife was sobbing. There was one child of about 4, one about 8, and one about 10. She had my 3 little boys, they're all boys. She said, they're all dead inside, they're all killed. And I said, I tried to pacify her, and it was just awful. And the ambulance was there, and the fire engines were there, and this rubble. And I prayed to Our Lady. It's really moving to think about. And I said, if these 3 children are saved, I will pray the rosary for the next 2 years. Please note, Marcus, I didn't say the rest of my life, because I know myself so well. I thought, don't make false promises. And I said, for 2 years.
That you cannot keep, right?
Exactly. So about a quarter of an hour later, somebody I knew, he was in fact, he had a travel agency. He was a big man. And he came down, and he was wearing a hard hat. He said, I'm going inside, and I'm going to find those children. So everyone said, don't be ridiculous. Enrique, his name was Enrique. He said, you can't go in there, you'll never come out. I said, I'm going in. And so he somehow got into all that rubble, and he was there. And after about 20 minutes, we heard a voice say, okay, I've got them. And of course there was elation, but we didn't know what they were going to be like. And he came out with these 3 children. They didn't have a scratch on them. Not a scratch, because a steel beam had fallen in such a position as to protect them from the rubble. The next day, in the Sur, which is the daily paper, it had, yesterday it told you, and said there was an absolute miracle. You know how they didn't realize what they were saying.
Yeah.
So that's how I had to pray the rosary for
There
2
you go.
years, you can see.
You got backed
But
into it.
praying it made me realize the whole thing, I found it a chore. And I thought, I've got to find out what it's all about. And I was living in England then, because I'd gone back to England. And then I went for a holiday in a part of the Costa Brava, the north of the Costa Brava, which is probably one of the most beautiful places in the world. And I was staying in a family hotel, and there was the Mediterranean in front of you, and a bay with all these rocky promontories. And I went for a walk along this bay in these beautiful fields, and it was so beautiful. And I came back to the hotel, and I thought, I must thank God for this beauty. And I decided to say the rosary. And as I prayed, I prayed it, saying the words, and I thought, what I've got to do is, I've got to find out what each decade, what it really means, where it all happened. I want to know what Mary was wearing. I want to know the sort of transport they travelled in. When she went to see her cousin Elizabeth, how did she get there? She was 3 months pregnant. What did they eat? What happened? And so I wrote the first draft in this place, which is called Agua Blava, and it's in Catalonia. And when I came back, I was doing lots of work, and I wrote it slowly, and this developed into a book which is called The Rosary in Space and Time.
It's now published by Gracewing, right?
Published by Gracewing and by LTP in the States.
Okay.
Now, the thing about this book is that it's called Space and Time because I'm also an amateur astronomer. And
You've always loved the stars.
I love the stars, always loved the stars, even as a child. And to me, there's never been any sort of conflict between science and faith, none whatsoever. God, the whole thing's so ridiculous, it's spurious, the whole thing. And what's his name, Einstein, actually said, science without religion is lame, but religion without science is blind. And he was absolutely right. This is all in my book. And the greatest scientists have always been practicing Christians.
Yes.
It's absolutely extraordinary. So that's why my first chapter is called Outer Space. And the second chapter is called Inner Space because it goes interiorly. And in fact, that first chapter was checked for being correct by the Jesuit astronomer at the Vatican, whose brother Guy Consul Magno. Well, anyway, I hope you have a look at it yourself. So that, now the rosary, the more I pray the rosary, the deeper I get into it, because the one way I don't pray the rosary, and I know this is not going to make a lot of people happy, is in a group in church. Because they don't really pray, it's very quick.
Sometimes it's just getting through it.
It's an act of love, fine, okay. And I've learned this myself. To pray the rosary properly, it takes about 20 minutes. And perfectly, I mean, the best place is in front of the Blessed Sacrament, which is why I was trying to pray it, because there you are alone, and you're praying interiorly. And one's interior life, you can feel something happening, and that's, I love the rosary.
Let me remind the audience again, the book is The Rosary in Space and Time.
Rosary in Space and Time.
A Grace Wing here in England.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned your love for the stars, and that reminds me of another aspect of Mary that I want you to make sure you have time to talk about.
This is my special thing at the moment, because it coincides with what's happening in the world.
Yes.
We all know about, well, you may not because you're American, but here in Europe we have this beautiful European flag, which is a brilliant blue background and 12 golden stars. Now, according to the European Parliament, the inspiration of these stars were mostly the number 12, because there were 12 sons of Jacob, there were 12 apostles, there were the labors of Hercules, for goodness sake, were 12. And also the stars, the whole flag symbolizes the unity of man. Well, this actually is complete falsehood. That is not the inspiration for the stars. This is the true story. In the 1950s, the Council of Europe wanted a flag. And so they asked artists throughout the world to submit or suggest designs. And at the end, it was fined down to two. One design was by the Spanish writer Salvador de Madariaga, and the other was by an employee, a staff member of the European Parliament, who was an artist. His name was Arsène Heitz. And he thought, I know exactly what I want to do. He'd been reading a book about the miraculous medal and the apparitions at the Rue du Bac. He said, I'm going to do a flag where the feature is stars, a ring of stars, a crown of stars like Our Lady had around her head at those apparitions on the miraculous medal. And in a background of a vivid blue, because that's the Marian color, and the date, this date of the entries for the competition coincided with the end of the Marian year, the same date. That is the true story. Now there are 47 European countries with 800 million people, and the Catholics there don't know the truth. And I want to make sure they do.
Well, a lot of them don't even know probably anymore the story of the miraculous medal and its place in, European history.
Unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's what I want, and that's why I'm writing about Our Lady of Europe, because I haven't mentioned about Our Lady of Europe.
Really quickly.
Our Lady of Europe was, Genesis goes back to when the Muslims invaded Spain.
Yeah.
And from Gibraltar, which was then in Spain, they built a mosque. And then in 1309, a Spanish king came and he swept them away, and he converted the mosque into a chapel, and he had a statue carved. This was in 1309, and he called it Our Lady of Europe. Now that was unusual, because usually it wasn't of his own kingdom or even of Spain, but Our Lady of Europe. the vicissitudes that's gone through, you wouldn't believe it, unbelievable. And a replica of that statue was brought over to London last year, and it's now in a church in nearby, and we want replicas of that statue, Our Lady of Europe, all over Europe, because that and the flag seem to be saying something directly from Our Lady.
Well, it's a prayer.
It's a prayer.
In essence, it's a
yes,
prayer,
it's a prayer, yes.
to Our Lady of
Yes,
Intercession
of course.
for
Yes.
all that's happening here in Europe.
But in Europe, you see, the constitution matters come up again, and they're refusing to mention Christianity, even God. They won't mention it. Well, that's outrageous, when the very flag symbolizes this.
Well, again, it's a denial of the history
It's
of the
denial
very
of the
land
history,
and
yes.
lives of all these, the formation of these countries.
Well, our present Pope has said that it's an apostasy what's going on now in Europe. It's an apostasy against the faith.
Ruth, thank you again for joining us on the journey home, and I want to remind the audience of your book, The Rosary in Space and Time, which is published by LTP in the States and Gracewing here in England. And I do encourage those of you who, like myself, a convert to the church, learn the Rosary late. And sometimes, as you mentioned, sometimes it takes a while. You can convert mentally quickly, but it takes a while to catch all the aspects, even of our practice, maybe the aspects of our life that we ought to change in process. But learning the devotions of the church sometimes takes a while to understand, and I recommend that book. So God bless you. Hope this program has been encouragement to your faith. Look forward to being with you again next time.